Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome to a very, very special episode of Angie Speaks uh, Movie Club. Thank you all so much for coming. I am super fucking excited to talk to you guys about this movie. I've been waiting to talk about it for a really, really long time. This is, I feel, probably one of the most important films of our time, and it's one that I often revisit every year almost. So today we're going to be talking about Children of Men, or should I say, Late Capitalism, the movie. um, so I guess we'll start with just kind of going over the plot, and then I'll talk about some of the key themes and some of the imagery, and then I will also talk about Zizek. Slavoj Žižek did a really wonderful kind of little segment for the DVD commentary about the film. So I'll post that in the chat so that you guys can have a look at it after we're done talking here. So let's dive right in. Children of Men is a dystopian science fiction set in the UK. And the film feels so much more real to me now than it ever did in the past, because so much of it parallels the realities that we're facing as a country today. So, yeah, I'll definitely talk a little bit more about that. The protagonist of the movie is pretty much, your standard stoic hero, depressed, disengaged, and a series of events occur that force him to engage with the world and to care. He had an activist past and had a child die with his partner, but then the infertility that kind of plagues this world in this dystopia sort of mirrors the loss that he experienced in his real life. So there's a lot of tension there with his character and the apathy that he feels. And the pregnant refugee girl coming into his life is the catalyst that sort of makes him engage again. And that's sort of the overall plot. But the thing about this film is there's a lot of beautiful tension going on between the background and the foreground of the film. The foreground of the film is obviously the general plot with the characters. The background of the film is the authoritarian kind of dystopian element of the film. And there's so many different shots in the film that sort of explore what's going on in this world. Much of the kind of dystopianism isn't necessarily something that's necessarily sort of explored in the plot. It's all sort of in the background of the film. You see these weird little events unfold, or these strange little scenes, or these signs that sort of indicate the world that we're in, that indicate the world that our characters are inhabiting. And the story and the characters sort of act as a cipher for us to experience this world through their actions as people. Um, so we have so many different themes to discuss. So I guess I'll start with the authoritarianism aspect of the film, which I found the most compelling, specifically because you have to watch the background of the film to really see it, to really see the dystopia. So in this film, the infertility crisis has gripped the world, and at the beginning of the film, we learn that baby Diego is dead. Baby Diego is an 18-year-old celebrity who is the youngest person on the planet at this time. So his death kind of symbolizes the death of hope in that regard, the death of innocence. And that's the very first thing that we see in the film. Um, and we learn that Britain has kind of become this cut off, isolated island in and of itself. There's this whole authoritarian anti-immigrant consensus in the country. The whole Britain prevails thing going on. We see this really brutal treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in the country. We see authoritarian police. We see complete despair and degradation to the point where there's actually an advert for assisted suicide kits. So like we've gone well beyond late capitalism here to the point where it's like a critical sort of crisis in the culture. Um, One of the really interesting things that Zizek talks about when he talks about the film is um, the idea that the world is untethered from history, and that this is a major symptom of late capitalism. The idea that because there's no future, the past starts to sort of disintegrate. And we see this with the protagonist when he goes to visit his brother, who is a collector of art, antiquities and art. And he asks his brother, why do you bother collecting this stuff? There's no future, so what's the point? And his brother says, well, I just don't really think about it. Um, these really amazing works of art. I think we see Michelangelo's like David in one frame, all these really amazing works of art that are completely depreciated because there's no future and it's untethered. One of the things that Slavoj Žižek also talks about is the idea that Britain, the reason why it's set in Britain, or they chose Britain as the setting, is because Britain is one of the only countries in the world without a constitution. And, the reason that Britain doesn't have a constitution is because there's always been this sort of ethos that it can rely on its historical past and the image around the culture and tradition. And, once that falls away, once you lose your tethering to history, this really deep despair starts to emerge. And that's the reason why Britain was probably the most ideal setting for this sort of story about late capitalism, about authoritarianism, and about despair and loss of the future. So this is all the stuff that's happening in the background of the film. We see this really brutal, authoritarian, isolationist kind of government that has really brutal treatment of immigrants, really awful kind of despair going on where people are like committing suicide. There's no children. There's even an ad, if you pay attention, for pets. It seems as if in this world, dogs and cats are like the new babies. So people kind of take really good care of their dogs and cats. And, that becomes kind of a trend in culture because there's absolutely no children. There's nobody under the age of 18 on the planet anymore. Um, and, that's really sort of a visceral representation of the idea of there being no future. And these are the sorts of things we see in the background. Well, we have our protagonist, and his apathy, I think, is quite sort of telling of modernity in a sense, because we're introduced to him seeing the death of baby Diego in the cafe. Sorry, Ranger Jenny says my dog is already my baby. My cat's my baby too. Yeah, so we see this sort of paralleled in his story. We learn about the death of his child fairly early on, and one of the first shots of the film is him going into the cafe and learning about the death of baby Diego. And his response to that is to just kind of go outside and like swig whiskey. This is clearly somebody who's incredibly disconnected from the world. It seemed as if when his child died, his child that he had with his missus, his wife, all hope kind of dissipated in that regard. He And then also experiencing that loss again on this sort of mass scale was another kind of trauma for him. So he seems to be incredibly sort of disengaged. And it's not until he gets the kind of call to action from his ex-wife, that they're trying to smuggle this refugee girl into the country. They need help getting papers. She knows he has connections with his brother, who's sort of prominent in the British government, and also somebody who has access to the materials that he needs. She offers him money because it seems that that's the only incentive that will shift him out of his apathy. So he agrees to do it, and this is sort of him getting back in touch with his, I guess, activist roots, because it is hinted at that they were both activists and they were both people that were sort of trying to fight against the turning current of authoritarianism before their life sort of fell apart in this very sort of visceral way. So, he gets involved, even though he's reluctant to. And he's incredibly confused about, why there's all this fuss over this one refugee woman. Why is she so important? And when we're introduced to her, it's very kind of it's very confusing, because it's like, why is this group, this underground activist group, making such a fuss about this, refugee woman? Why is she sort of this symbol for them? And it turns out that she's pregnant. She's the first person to conceive in decades. And I thought that that was a really beautiful image, that this sort of black refugee woman, somebody who's part of the most downtrodden aspect of society, is almost like the new mother of humanity. Um, there's all kinds of like interesting pagan shit going on there. I'll probably go into that a little bit later as like a little treat or whatever. But yeah, this black refugee woman, the most downtrodden of society, she is now the symbol of hope that everybody's to look to, the new Madonna, the Black Madonna. And she is then almost sort of cynically appropriated for political aims. This sort of, I guess, anarchist group, I guess they're like kind of an anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian activist group, want to take the baby from her and use the baby as a political tool. And this is when we really see the protagonist sort of spring into action and protect this child and protect this woman. And this was a very kind of powerful image, because in films, you seldom see Black women being seen as vulnerable or worthy of protection. So that was kind of a powerful thing to see. And that's kind of what brings the protagonist out of his apathy and into action. That his quest to protect this woman and her child, this one last symbol of hope for humanity, even to the point where he gives his life for that cause, after being stuck in apathy for a very, very long time. So I guess we'll get into some of the like really interesting themes. So infertility is obviously a massive theme that sticks out from the beginning of the film. But there's also a lot of like Madonna imagery, like Madonna and Christ imagery. There's the famous statue of of Mary mourning the body of Christ, which we see mirrored in the scene where they're in the Bexhill refugee camp, and there's this mother holding, the body of her dead son. When the pregnancy is revealed, the Black refugee character, sorry, I forget her name. She is standing among cows, and cows have traditionally been a symbol of fertility, of motherhood. It's almost like a holy scene. There's the scene when, there's all the fighting going on, the sort of battle war scene in the Bexhill refugee camp, where all the soldiers lay down their arms at the sound of the cry of an infant. Everybody sort of stops what they're doing. The fighting stops at the cry of an infant. This very visceral sort of human thing that represents a future, one that was lost. All the despair and the apathy and the war and the pain stops and halts at the cry of this infant, because it's representative of the future, and the future being brought about by somebody who's not necessarily the ideal person who would bring about the future. We even see people step in to help, and that wouldn't normally help, who are usually self-interested. So it really does, there is this sort of theme of the compassion of humanity, and how people are willing to sort of pull and come together around this sort of hopeful ideal. The infertility in the world, it's almost sort of viewed as a punishment. I don't know if any of you guys know about this, but Children of Men is actually a novel that was written by a far-right Christian person. That was what it originally was. It was a a far-right kind of analysis of society, and obviously the creators of the film appropriated it in order to kind of give it a new message, which I thought was really interesting. So the infertility, it's almost seen as a punishment. I mean, in the background of the film, we see religious sects and organizations, claiming that it's a punishment from God. Nobody really understands why it's happening. only that a reflection of the death of modernity, the death of the future, the death of any sort of hope for humanity, and the sort of limbo that people are stuck in because of this, and because of this sort of phenomenon. Hang on, Regan Jenny says she did joke that she never had sex when asked who the father was, like the Virgin Mary. Yes, there is that kind of immaculate conception joke that was made. But that's the thing, is the child's father is never revealed. It's not sort of this sort of thing. So yeah, it kind of is an immaculate conception because it's a spiritual birth, because it's a symbol of the renewal of hope, the renewal of the future. So it's quite funny in that regard that, you know, the father isn't necessarily in the picture in this film, and that she's just kind of pregnant and like wandering around, because really and truly, symbolically, it is a spiritual birth in that regard. But yeah, back to the topic. Nobody really knows why the infertility has come about. And it also represents the larger death of the future in that regard. And also, you know, late capitalism, it represents the like I said, the death of the future, the death of hope, and an untethering from history, an untethering from our continuity as a species, and what that does to our consciousness. So yeah, it's very interesting. You know, there's all kinds of interesting themes around, you know, what's to come. And the really interesting thing about this film is it is sort of prescient. This film came about during, you know, the fucking Bush era. It's not a new film, and it was almost anticipating what was to come based on the historical trends that have occurred already in our society. And you know, walking around London these days, it does feel like Children of Men sometimes. It really does. You know, I've had those vibes assault me once in a while. I've had those sorts of experiences out and about, where, you know, you can really see, when you're really kind of tuned in that almost like meditative state, when you're walking around and you're looking at the foreground of society, you're looking at the weird authoritarian messages that are being posted into your consciousness everywhere. You're seeing like the brutality of the police. You're seeing all of this weird treatment of people who are refugees, or people who aren't, you know, traditionally British. You know, it's sort of seeping in these like strange authoritarian messages. This film really tells art through the foreground, and that was what Zizek was talking about when he said that this film is an example of what cinema must be if it's going to continue as art within the 21st century. These sort of very subtle messages aren't things that you necessarily see in a lot of movies these days. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the side characters. My favorite side character was Michael Caine's character, the old hippie guy, the old hippie guy that they go to crash with. He represents, in my opinion, and also Zizek's opinion too, because Zizek mentioned this in the video that he did about it. The old left, the old guard of the left, this sort of impotent baby boomer generation, that really tried. They really tried to not have culture go down this path, but because of their own blind spots and because of their own capitulation to certain systemic things, they were unable to make it stop. So he's just sort of retired into the woods with his wife, and he's just trying his best to do what he can where he can, and he's just kind of waiting out Kali Yuga. That's one of the things that is mentioned. He mentions the Kali Yuga, and the Kali Yuga is a Hindu concept, the Hindu concept of a dark age, basically an age of decadence, darkness, and despair, like the end of a cycle in that regard, the end of a dark ending to a cycle that kind of gives birth to the new. So when he mentions the Kali Yuga, he's talking about this age that we're in. He's talking about this age of late capitalism. And he sees his like little forest place in the woods as his little safe haven while he like waits out Kali Yuga. And you know, he's a very good-natured person. he's incredibly, you can tell he still gives a shit about humanity and where the world is going, but the weight of the failures of his youth kind of weigh on his shoulders. We see this in the pictures he has around of his activism, the fact that his wife is now somewhat catatonic and she can't speak and she's sort of lost hope. She's given way to the despair. It kind of, it made me feel like I was looking into my future a little bit, because that character reminds me a lot of Jake, my boyfriend. If you've ever seen, he's here. That Michael Caine's character in Children of Men.
Oh, what? Just because he's an old boy?
Yeah, he's like an old hippie that likes to smoke weed, and he listens to Aphex Twin, and I hope I'm not going to be the catatonic fucking wife in future. I hope that's not the point. But it kind of scared me. It scared me a little bit, because it did scare me a little bit, because I see my partner in this person, and I see how they tried and how their activism was really kind of thwarted by the just overbearingness of late capitalism, and how now they're sort of these impotent, empty shells of themselves. That really hit me on a visceral level. But in that sense, he kind of, in an archetypical sense, he sort of worked as the Empress energy, if any of you are familiar with the tarot, sort of like the nurturing energy that brought the struggling kind of characters on their journey in, gave them that spot of rest, gave them that spot of recuperation, and also gave them the kind of sage-like messages that would carry them through the rest of the journey, the rest of the darkness of the journey. So in that, and he also gave his life to protect them as well. So even though there's this like impotence and there's this sort of despair that this character represents, of like the death of the old left and the death of that old idealism, he still remains defiant until the end. And when he died, I did cry. I always cry when I watch that scene, because I don't know, he just reminds me of like what my boyfriend would be like as an old man, and it gets my heart every time. It gets my heart. So yeah, the next side character that I found really very, very interesting was the new age hippie lady, who sort of acted as the midwife in this sort of situation. She was the one that was looking after the refugee lady. She was a midwife in real life before the crisis hit and babies stopped being born. So she was one of the people who most viscerally experienced this crisis, going from being a midwife and delivering babies and really being in this visceral kind of connection to the new birth of life into the world, to seeing that completely dissipate. She was almost the perfect kind of God-sent person, or goddess-sent person, in order to help our protagonist through this transition, in order to nurture and look after this woman who's carrying the future in her womb. There's a lot of divine feminine imagery as well in this film, and I think that that's what she was there to represent. There was a lot of mother, maiden, crone, archetypical shit going on, and a lot of Madonna, Mary, Mother of Christ shit going on. A lot of like the essence of like the divine feminine kind of bleeding through, to kind of destroy the illusions of this like hyper masculine late capitalist like dystopia. This black woman, this black refugee woman, and the fact that she's sort of carrying the future in her womb. She's almost like a goddess. She's almost like the mother of humanity. It's a very interesting theme. Hang on, I'm just going to read some comments. It's a relatable fear, seeing how people who've come before have ended up shutting down in various ways and hoping really bad for it not to end up that way too. Yeah, it is really sad. That's kind of what we see is like in this film, which is another theme that I want to explore, is sort of the death of activism and the corruption of activism. We see the death of activism in Michael Caine's character and his wife. They really tried. At the end of the day, these people are only human, and late capitalism is a very big thing to face down on your own. They tried their fucking best. And we also see it in our protagonist and his wife. They were once activists too. his wife continued on being an activist until obviously she tragically died in that really insane scene. And it's as if he took on the mantle for her. He took on the mantle to in her place. But it just kind of showed how easy it is to sort of lose faith, how easy it is to lose hope in the face of these sort of insurmountable odds, and how it takes almost this spiritual, symbolic, archetypical miracle in order to sort of break through that consciousness. The activist group that we see in the film, they're very corrupt. They don't really care about the humanity or the symbology of what's going on. They want to use the baby and the pregnancy as a political tool. They're so wrapped up in their short-term aims that they completely lose sight of the big picture. And it ends up corrupting them to the point where they themselves sort of become antagonists, even though their hearts are in the right place, because they've lost sight of what's really important. They've allowed the darkness of the Kali Yuga to overtake them. You know, they then sort of become the antagonists in that regard. And I thought that that was a really powerful message, for the left, that we can't lose sight of the big picture, and that oftentimes it is these archetypical, symbolic, visceral things that really affect people's humanity. And you can't be out of touch with that, because if your activism is out of touch with that, then you're really not going to be able to capture people's hearts and minds. You're going to end up becoming a more dangerous, sort of unstable force. So it was a really interesting thing. I know a lot of people on the left were annoyed by the fact that the leftists, quote unquote, in the movie were kind of the antagonist, and it was the apolitical, kind of apathetic guy that ended up being the hero. But oftentimes that can happen. If you're bogged down in ideology to the point where it makes you forget your humanity, humanity is the most important thing. That's what we're all sort of operating on. That's the thing that leads us. That's the thing that drives us. And if your ideology puts you out of touch with your humanity to the point where you're willing to use people cynically, then you got a problem. You definitely have a problem. You don't have to have read Karl Marx in order to understand that, like, capitalism is a shit thing, and that, humanity needs a more bright and unmiserable future. And yeah, it ends up being the apolitical, apathetic guy who ends up saving the day and being the protagonist and the hero of the story. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I take questions was the scenes in the Bexhill refugee camp. Those were some of the hardest scenes to watch. You not only do you see brutality happening towards migrants, not only do you see senseless violence happening towards, minorities and people who are seeking asylum, there's also, terrible war scenes. We also see the backlash as well. We also see the idea of disposable humanity in a very, very visceral way. And this character and, the refugee woman have to fight through this absolute pit of despair, this hell, in order to get to the tomorrow, the boat that is basically symbolic of the future. And one of the things that Zizek talks about in his take on the film is the idea that the boat is symbolic. The boat, the tomorrow, represents an untethering from the past. That the only way that humanity can really reach this future, the future that's been on hold for so long, is by untethering ourselves from the past, by starting afresh, by starting anew. And, that's what this sort of tomorrow boat represents. And, the symbolic nature of the boat really rings true at the end, because our protagonist dies. He doesn't get to see that tomorrow, but he helps facilitate it. And, I guess the protagonist kind of represents us in that regard, because we may not get to see that tomorrow, but we can still help facilitate it. We can still help to push it forward. It was very beautiful. The ending definitely made me cry. It made me made me tear up quite a bit. It made me tear up quite a bit. It's a very beautiful film. You know, the aspects of late capitalism in there, it's almost too real to be true, especially now as Britain becomes more isolationist. There's a lot of hostility towards refugees and immigrants. There are camps like the Bexhill camp, in Europe, where refugees are basically stripped of human rights and treated poorly. There's a new era of authoritarianism. The Overton window has shifted really far to the right. Boris Johnson may be very well be our next prime minister. Like there's a lot of very visceral issues that this film almost saw as a prescient had a sort of prescient vision of. And it does frighten me because it kind of seems like that's the trajectory that we're going down as a society at the moment. This hard shift towards this sort of dystopian authoritarian Britain. And yeah, it scares the shit out of me. It definitely scares the shit out of me. It's a sad thing because when I watched this film when it first came out, I was fairly young, and it seemed like a future that was far enough away to be safe, but near enough at the same time to be viscerally frightening. But there was still an element of distance there that kept me kind of like, I guess, apathetic about it. But now when I watch it, it just feels too real. It feels too real. It feels like this future is a lot closer than we could actually anticipate. And there needs to be that symbol of hope, that thing that sort of breaks through all of the illusions and hits us on that human level. And in this film, it was, the cry of an infant, people seeing and hearing the cry of an infant after decades of that not being the case. I don't know what the catalyst is going to be within our reality now, but it needs to be something that really does affect us on that primal kind of level. In my opinion, even the soldiers laid down their arms, those who were fighting on behalf of the authoritarian regime. As soon as they heard the cry of the infant, something primal within them understood that this was hope, that this was the future. And even they laid down their arms. And that's the kind of thing we need right now, is something that unites us as a species, unites us as a people against, this dark age, this sort of Kali Yuga that we're entering. Yeah. So before we end, I'm going to take questions. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Or if anyone wants to actually hop on the stream, I'm more than happy to like post the link in the chat if you guys want to like give your take. So yeah, I'm just gonna wait for questions and kind of waffle on until I see any. But if not, we'll sort of end it here. And yeah, do let me know if you want the link, if you want to come and have your take or talk about what you want to talk about. Okay, so Google Analytics asks, do you think that the infertility begins the end of times? Sorry. Do you think that I'm not wearing my glasses, sorry. Do you think that the idea infertility brings the end of times is unequivocally right wing? I don't think so. I really don't. Unless you're like an anti-natalist. Because I'm training at the moment to be a doula and stuff. So I'm also kind of viscerally kind of interacting with this sort of whole like life, death, rebirth type of thing. And like, I don't think so, because whether we like it or not, whether we want them or not, whether we are interested in creating that sort of future for ourselves or not, children are the future. There needs to be people to populate the planet in order for things to move forward. And children have always symbolically sort of represented the future. And I think that a culture that becomes so solipsistic about its time, that it forgets about children, forgets about the future, forgets about what children represent. I think that that's kind of dangerous. And that's not to say that everybody has to have children or everybody needs to be interested in having children. No, that's not everybody's destiny. But for those of us who do produce children, and for those children that are currently existing on the planet, It's our job to take their development, their health, their safety, and their nurture seriously, and to help celebrate and shepherd into the world new life, because I do want to see a future. I do want to see humanity have a continuity. I do want to see us continuing to evolve as a species. So I don't really take the whole antinatalist position seriously, and I don't think that it's like a right wing thing to be worried about infertility. There's a specific way that the right wing worries about it that's like really toxic and fucked up and like weird and like Handmaid's Tale-y, but I don't think that that's like the position of everybody who sort of worries about this sort of thing or who is concerned about this sort of thing. Yeah. Uh Ranger Jenny asks, one of the scariest things for me was the billboard that said something like avoiding fertility checks is a crime. I can see how it could be worse, like the Handmaid's Tale situation in the future. Yeah, it's really fucked up. The idea again of trying to sort of control and so it's just the idea of kind of starting trying to control and sort of put harsh tires on this sort of divine feminine force of like fertility, something that exists within nature, something that's supposed to be free, something that's not supposed to be, regulated by the government, whether that be, women's rights to have abortions or women's rights to have children and have the security to take care of those children if they so choose to do so. These are all things that shouldn't be, policed by society. They're things that should be nurtured, and they're things that should be kind of left in a sort of hands-off kind of thing. And we are seeing a lot of weird right-wing hysteria around fertility and women's reproductive rights now, but not because they're necessarily concerned for the thriving of humanity, but because they're concerned for the thriving of a specific race or a specific type of humanity. Because they would love, there's been programs of eugenics in the past, in countries like India, even in the United States and in the UK. A lot of the countries in that were once under the British Empire had things like forced sterilization of people who they believed were undesirable or unpalatable to the status quo. In America, the Tuskegee experiments, all kinds of different things where they would, literally against the will of these women take away their fertility. So there's this sort of weird cultural schizophrenia where there's this like desire for one specific demographic of people to be fertile, and then people who are undesirable get their rights to that sort of happiness and that sort of fulfillment taken away from them. It's not even just about going in and physically sterilizing someone. Even having the economic comfortability or mobility to be able to child rear and properly take care of children in a family, that's now denied to so many people in our generation. Of millennials. I said our generation because I kind of assume that a lot of us are millennials, but I'm talking about millennials specifically. But yeah, like a lot of people in the millennial generation, have had to put off the idea of family, have had to put off the idea of children altogether because it's just not economically feasible for them to do so. Like I know that I would one day love to start a family. It's been one of my biggest dreams for a really long time, but I don't know if I could see myself affording it for a very fucking long time. It's kind of like if you come from a specific demographic in society, then fertility is something that should be happy and should be celebrated for you. But if you come from an undesirable demographic in society, then fuck your ideas about fertility, fuck you, type of situation. It's a very strange, weird cultural schizophrenia around the idea of fertility, and women's reproductive rights. But in my opinion, I don't think this is something that should be very tightly controlled by the government. And I also think that it's a divine, natural force that should be nurtured. I don't think that we should be denigrating people who want to have families. I think we should be protecting and providing for them. But I also don't think that we should be forcing people into kind of filling demographic holes and forcing people to bolster demographics by giving birth and denying them access to reproductive care, which is kind of what we see going on in the world today. Okay, there's more questions. Canada is still doing eugenics. Paul V says. Um, I didn't know about that. I mean, I've heard about some of the really awful things that were going on with Native Americans in Canada, and eugenics. It's really, really messed up. Um, uh, Ranger Jenny says if the right actually cared about fertility, they'd worry about environmental issues like BPA and the connection to increasing rates of things like uh, polycystic ovary disease that cause infertility. Yeah, that's the thing. Their hysteria around around the issue of fertility is specifically to preserve a very specific demographic, not because they actually care about the continuity of humanity or anything like that. Ranger Jenny says, yeah, affordability is an issue. Definitely is. There are plenty of people who are, in the millennial kind of demographic who would love to start families, who would love to bring new life into the world and nurture it. Lots of people I know who would be wonderful parents and who would raise very well-adjusted kids that would probably, do good for the world, but it's just not feasible for them economically to do so. So it's something that they just sort of put off or just like don't do altogether. So yeah, that it's a demographic control thing. And I feel like once you start messing in the domain of the love goddess / fertility goddess, bad shit always happens. Like there are loads of countries that have tried to control their demographics through things like full sterilization, or in China, for instance, they have they have the one child policy, and because of traditional cultural laws around male children, the society is now full of there's a gender imbalance. There's more men than there are women, so there's a lot of issues going on with marriage and all kinds of things, and it's caused a really huge problem in their demographics. Don't mess with the fucking love goddess, because she'll strike back. She likes to be left alone to kind of do her thing. you know um uh Someone said, I saw a meme today that said, please spray or neuter your Democrats, and it made me so upset because eugenics is still happening. Yeah, it is. It's really fucked up. On one hand, you have people who are being forced to conceive, with these like really horrible draconian abortion laws that are going on in parts of the world, especially recently in America, in the South. And then you have eugenics, where people are having their opportunities to create new life, to actually, bring forth fertility, being taken away arbitrarily by the state or some other entity. Rago Jetty says, I am 33 with a fur baby. Yeah, I have a fur baby too, and it kind of seems like it's gonna stay that way for a while. Unless I come into some serious fucking money. Unless I come into some serious fucking money, I gotta put off my fertility goddess vibes. I left them in the Mayday video. The Mayday video is where they're at, but I guess for now I'm like firmly in my like weird crone archetype. But yeah, the fertility aspect of the film actually did come from the right-wing aspect of the novel. Because I did mention that the novel was written by, a hard right sort of Christian fundamentalist. And I think it was really interesting how they took this theme and subverted it on the head. Because it could have been very easy for them to take sort of this weird anti-natalist stance, which y'all know I really hate that. I'm not a big fan of the whole anti-natalist stance, just to kind of be subversive and edgy and like contrarian. But they didn't. There's still this sort of theme of children being the future, and the despair that's caused when this sort of the future is taken away, and also kind of children symbolically representing the future and how the future kind of dissipates and dismantles under late capitalism. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's really, really interesting, and it's a very, really, really great film with a lot of really interesting themes. a really amazing work of art. It's worth multiple viewings. So if this was your first time watching it, I would recommend watching it again in a couple months, because there's so much that you catch in the background of the film. So much of the world is sort of unraveled in the background of the film, and it creates this incredibly rich viewing experience. And the cinematography as well, some of the best I've ever seen on film. These like very long trucking shots that capture this really intense action. Like, it's fucking crazy. Like, I absolutely loved it. I really, really loved it. It's the pacing and the tension and just everything about the film really, really drags you into the picture in this like very visceral way. It's a true work of art. Um, Ranger Jenny says, I had never seen it or even heard of it, so I'm glad you did this. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely a big one to watch for. It's definitely one that kind of slips under the radar, especially because when it originally came out, it was marketed kind of as an action flick, which I really hate that studios do that, because they want to get butts in the seats. They want people to fucking watch the film. They want people to pay attention to the film. They don't want to market it as this like big, like dramatic political, piece, because that's not going to be appealing to like Joe Schmo. So they kind of just marketed it as like, oh, look, it's Clive Owen in this like sci-fi action flick. And I think that put a lot of people off the film who would otherwise have really gained something from it. So it's one of those films that has definitely slipped under the radar and that deserves a lot more attention, in my opinion. Yeah, it's definitely great. So I'm going to give a call now for last questions. And if we don't have any more questions, then I will wrap this up and bid you guys adieu. It's been very nice talking to you. I know I've been MIA for a bit because I've been traveling and, up and down for summer. So it's been nice to see some familiar faces, Paul V, Google Analytics, a new face, Ranger Jenny. It's been really lovely to kind of see you guys and catch up with you guys. I'm going to be traveling again on Tuesday morning. So I'm going to be in New York City for like a week and a bit. So yeah, but I'll still be on the Discord to like chat to you guys and stuff. And then when I come back, it will be new Angie Speaks video right away. There are two topics that I'm sort of deliberating on at the moment, of which ones I want to do. So I might put a poll up on the Patreon and the Discord so that you guys can vote on that, to hear what you guys think I should cover next. So this one will be like the follow up to the Twin Peaks video that I recently did, because that's the latest video I did. So this will be something different. So yeah, I've got a couple of topics that I wanted to run by you guys. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for coming. I've had such a great time discussing this film with you. I hope that you were able to kind of get some themes or unpick a couple of things or find some resonance in some of the things that I said. Feel free to continue the discussion in the Discord as well, in the Movie Club channel. I would love to hear more about what you guys think about the film, especially for those of you who didn't catch this stream, those of you who missed it and are watching the repeat. I would love to hear what you guys think. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for coming. Goodbye, Google Analytics. Goodbye, Lito. Goodbye, Ranger Jenny. Goodbye, Paul V. Thank you so much for coming. And I shall see you. And Andy. Bye, Andy. We can't forget Andy now, can we? I hope I haven't forgotten anyone else. Thank you so much for coming, and I shall see you guys later. Mwah. Bye.